Hello again, and welcome back to the Sports Parent Academy. One of the biggest challenges athletes face at this level isn't just improving performance, it's staying healthy. With increased training intensity, competition schedules, and physical demands, injury can become a real concern. But with the right approach, many injuries can be prevented. That's why recovery, rest, and injury management are just as important as training. In this session, we'll talk about strategies to keep your athlete's body in top shape. Things like proper warm-ups, stretching routines, sleep, and recovery methods like ice baths and physiotherapy. Regular checkups and early injury detection can also make all the difference in keeping them on the field and out of rehab. So let's explore how to help your young athlete perform at their peak while protecting their long-term health. Dr. Heller, thank you for being here. As young athletes push their bodies to a higher level of competition, injuries are a major concern for them and their parents. We are familiar with many obvious injuries such as sprains, torn ligaments, broken bones, but we have less understanding of damage to the body's physiological systems. I know that you are concerned with the threat of extremely high body temperatures that can lead to heat stroke. Can you tell us about the causes and consequences of overheating?
Randy, it's a pleasure to talk to you about this really important subject. I really appreciate the efforts you're going to. The causes of hyperthermia, which is body temperatures above normal, are our normal activities. So if we work, we produce body heat, and that raises our internal temperature. If we do that in a hot environment, it makes it even worse because we can't dissipate, we can't lose that heat to the environment. So the causes of hyperthermia are not pathological causes, there are normal behavior, and therefore there are behavioral measures we can take to mitigate them. So in terms of consequences, the consequences are quite severe. Just about all of our body systems are affected by temperature. And people don't realize that we actually live on what I like to call the thermal edge between life and death. Now that sounds rather dramatic, but we regulate our body temperatures about 97 degrees, little higher, 98. There's debate these days as to what actually is normal body temperature. But let's say 97, 98 degrees. And only a few degrees above that, we run into, of course, heat exhaustion, and we run into borderline heat stroke. And finally, at only about 103 degrees Fahrenheit, we enter into frank heat stroke, which is frequently lethal. So we live very close to the lethal limits of our body in terms of temperature. And that means that we don't have a lot of bandwidth to ignore our body temperatures and just work harder, work in hotter environments, and just ignore the fact that our body temperatures are rising. So temperature affects all of our physiological systems. And if you think about athletic performance, the components of peak athletic performance are strength, of course, how much you can lift, how much you can push, the power output, how much you can exert over a period of time, and then endurance, how long you can keep it up. And finally, there is skill, and we look to our coaches for skill, but I'll show you that temperature plays a role in being able to exercise our skills. And cognition, we have to be able to play smart. We have to be able to be smart about our decisions with respect to our bodies, not only our performance. So all of these components of optimal peak performance are sensitive to temperature. And I'm going to tell you about some of those. We'll start with strength, we'll start with power output, but endurance in terms of aerobic sports. And you'd say, well, how does skill and cognition fit in? Well, our brains the function of our brains are very much influenced by temperature. Hyperthermia, hypothermia, both will affect our cognitive capacity. And you can't really use your skill. You can't really use your knowledge of your performance unless your brain is working perfectly fine. So why do we overheat? What are the causes? As I said, it's essentially just our normal activities to extreme. So when we work, whether it's lifting, whether it's performing, whether it's competing, our muscles are producing heat. Now, we take in energy with our food. That energy is broken down to molecules called ATP that are able to fuel our physiological functions, such as our muscle contraction. But 90% of the energy in the food we take in simply appears as heat because energy transformations are not efficient. So the harder we work, the higher our metabolism, the more heat we produce within our bodies. And the hotter the environment, the more difficult it is to dissipate that heat. So many people don't appreciate the fact that an ambient temperature, an air temperature of 95 degrees at 95% humidity, which is common in many parts of our country, that combination, 95 and 95, that can be lethal to a human being. And the reason is that under those conditions, we cannot lose the heat that our bodies are producing. Okay? So hyperthermia, high body temperature, is a consequence of what we would consider totally normal activity. And it is really dangerous. Now, do I exaggerate? I don't think so. Because if we look in the records of heat deaths among athletes, it's quite shocking. So between 2018 and 2022, 12 pro football players died of heat stroke. If we look at high school players in the last 25 years, records show that 50 high school football players have died of heat stroke. And most of these deaths have occurred during practice. So it's voluntary exposure to high temperature, which is a problem, not a forced or pathological exposure. So why? Many of our tissues are sensitive to high temperature. So kidney failure is commonly associated with hyperthermia, heart failure. Muscle damage is one that many athletes experience because if their individual muscles get to very high temperatures, they begin to break down. And when they break down, they release toxins into the blood. And those toxins make you very, very sick. Okay? So overheating is really, really dangerous. And it's important that people realize that and people take appropriate measures to avoid exposure to extremely high temperatures.
That's really important for parents, coaches, trainers, and athletes to know. However, in many parts of our country where our young athletes train and compete, temperatures of the environment can regularly rise to high levels. And high levels of heat are produced in the individual from the high levels of exertion in practice and in competition. Hence, overheating is unavoidable. What can we do to minimize overheating and heat injury?
The first most important thing is awareness, to listen to your body. So the symptoms of hyperthermia are quite common. They're nausea, they're dizziness, they're just feeling physically fatigued, like you cannot take one more step, you cannot do one more lap around the track. So these are symptoms of hyperthermia. Now, the other thing is taking certain measures to prevent hyperthermia. So you want to stay hydrated, you want to seek cool environments whenever possible. If it's possible, it's good to practice to exercise and to compete in cooler environments. I know that's not always possible, but avoid the hottest times of the day for your exercise or for your work. So it's all common sense, really. But it's important to realize that feeling cool is not necessarily being cool. We sense temperature in our skin. So just putting a cold towel on our bodies makes us feel cool. That doesn't mean we've lowered our core body temperature. It means that we've put in a signal to our thermostat that says, you're cool. You don't have to worry about it. Well, that's not exactly true. Now, let me give you an analogy. I'm sure many times you might have been expecting guests for dinner or going out for dinner, but you want to get that workout in before you have to get dressed and really be ready to engage socially. So what do? You run and you take a cold shower. Oh, that feels so good. It takes away all of that burden of excess heat, you think. Then you get dressed and you are ready, and 5 minutes later you break out into a sweat. And the reason is you still have all that excess heat in your body. You have just sent in a false message to your thermostat, the thermostat in your brain. You've sent in a false signal to the thermostat by putting cold stimulus on your temperature sensors. Let me give you an analogy. If you wanted to cool down your house, cool down your room, would you put a wet cloth over the thermostat? Right? So that's essentially what you're doing when you take a measure that makes you feel cool, but it's not really extracting a significant amount of heat from the core of your body. So the bottom line is, don't ignore what your body is telling you. Yes, you can always do more. You can push harder. You can run it out, but that's not necessarily the right thing to do.
Even with best preventative practices, heat stress is an unavoidable fact of athletic conditioning and performance. Rapid and effective recovery is critical. What suggestions do you have for speeding recovery of athletes from overheating?
Let me extend a little bit to the thermostat model in a little bit more detail. So you have a thermostat in your brain, and that thermostat is sort of right above the back of the roof of your mouth. And that thermostat responds to its own temperature. So if your core body temperature goes up, the thermostat turns on your heat loss mechanisms. Okay? If your body temperature goes down, the thermostat shuts off your heat loss mechanisms and triggers heat production, like shivering. Okay? So in your house, you may have a temperature that's quite comfortable for most people, but all of a sudden you might feel cool. So what do? You go to the thermostat and you turn up the set point. Okay? So that is sort of what happens when you have a peripheral stimulus, either heat or cold. What it does is it resets the set point in your thermostat. And that's why you can be overheated, but yet you can cool your skin, and that will change the set point. It'll raise the set point, and it'll shut off the mechanisms you have for heat loss. So it's important to be taking measures that extract heat from your body and not just make you feel cool. So what we've done is we have invented a way, a means, a technology to extract heat from the body very, very efficiently. And what that does is it allows the thermostat to continue to call for heat loss, and at the same time, it's pulling heat out of the body. So let me explain to you how we came upon this discovery. We actually were facing a different challenge. Had a bet with an anesthesiologist friend. And he said, "You guys think you know so much about temperature regulation. I bet you couldn't solve a problem we have in the recovery room." Well, what is that? Well, patients come out of surgery very cold, and it takes the nurses hours to get them to stop shivering. It's uncomfortable for the patients, it's uncomfortable for the nurses. That's a trivial problem. No, it's a very hard problem, or it was a very hard problem. And the reason was, when you're under anesthesia, you vasodilate. Okay? You have no ability to control your heat loss to the environment. So when you come out of anesthesia, you are cold and you just vasoconstrict. All your blood vessels shut down and sequester your blood in the core of your body. So if you don't have blood flowing into the periphery of your body, you can't absorb heat that's being applied in hot blankets or infrared lamps or whatever. So we got a crazy idea and we said, okay, let's put an arm in a vacuum, a slight vacuum, a slight negative pressure environment. That will pull blood into the arm and will heat the arm, and then that hot blood will go back into the core of the body. We thought we'd have a small improvement. No, we had a huge improvement. The first time we tried this with a crude device that we made, and we took it over to the recovery room. The first patient, instead of 1 or 2 hours for rewarming, it was less than 10 minutes. And we couldn't believe it. We couldn't imagine how in the world we could get that much heat into the body. So we started looking into it in a little bit more detail, and we found out the surprising thing, it had nothing to do with the arm. It was only the hand. And then we looked into the old literature about the anatomy of blood vessels in the hand, in the arm. And what we found was that there are very unusual blood vessels in the palms of the hands, the soles of the feet, and the face. These areas of skin are called non-hairy skin or glabrous skin. Now, if you think of our relatives, by relatives I'm speaking zoologically, our mammalian relatives, they all have fur. So if you have fur, it's kind of hard to lose heat, right? So they have evolved these blood vessels in the non-hairy skin, the pads of their feet, the tongue, the ears, and these special blood vessels are able to shunt the arterial blood to the veins, bypassing the capillaries. Arteries are high pressure vessels, capillaries are high resistance vessels, and veins are low pressure, high flow vessels. Okay, so what we have here is we have a mechanism for shunting large amounts of blood carrying heat to these special body surfaces. So what we were doing is we were using these heat loss mechanisms in reverse in the recovery room. We were using them to put heat into the body, and we realized, whoa, this is a mechanism for losing heat. So we started investigating that. And what we found was that we could essentially extract large amounts of heat from the body core through either the palms of the hands, the soles of the feet, or the face.
Besides prevention of injury, I understand you have shown that preventing or at least mitigating overheating can improve physical conditioning and performance. Could you tell us about your work that has led to some amazing gains in conditioning and improvements in performance?
Yes, that's the exciting part. I love to talk about that. In order to do those first experiments to show that we could extract heat from the body through these surfaces, skin surfaces, we had to have someone hot. So my lab assistant at that time was a gym rat. He loved to go to the gym after work. So we said to him, look, we'll rig up some equipment here in the lab so you do your workout in the lab, and then we'll experiment with how best to get that excess heat out of your body. That's exactly what we did. So he liked to do pull-ups. So we had him do sets of pull-ups. We had each set to muscle failure, and then a 3-minute rest, and then another set to muscle failure. And 10 sets altogether. And this was just to raise his core temperature. And of course, what we saw was a fatigue curve. Every set would be fewer and fewer and fewer and fewer. One day, for no reason at all, and what we were doing was just extracting heat after the 10th set. This was just the experiment. What sort of a vacuum did we need? What sort of a temperature differential did we need? Well, one day, for no reason whatsoever, he went back to the pull-up bar after we cooled him. And he did the same number of pull-ups as in his first set. We said, holy crow, what does that mean? And that means that the muscle failure is due, at least in part, to the rise in temperature of the muscle. So we then started cooling him after every other set of pull-ups. And his fatigue curve plateaued. And within the next 5 weeks of experiments like this, he went from doing 180 pull-ups, which already was remarkable, to 618. So you can imagine doing 618 pull-ups in 10 sets. Remarkable. So that was the initial discovery. And other individuals found out about it. We repeated the experiment with our wrestling team, members of our wrestling team, and they came in doing pull-ups. They averaged about 100 pull-ups in their 10 sets at the beginning of the experiment. And 10 weeks later, we're on a quarter system, so 10 weeks is normal time you interact with a group of students. And in 10 weeks, they had increased to an average of about 250 pull-ups. So increase of 2.5-fold. So some professional athletes heard about this because a lot of our Stanford athletes move on to professional roles. So we had one of our previous tight ends who was at the 49ers, and he decided, he inquired and he wanted to see what this was all about. So he came over and we said to him, well, what exercise do you like? He says, oh, well, dips. I like to do dips. I can do a lot of dips. I can do 40 dips in my first set, and then I'll do usually 5 sets before I'm totally exhausted. So we had him come over, and without cooling, that's exactly what he did. And he said after his 5th set, no, that's it. I've had it. I'm really pooped. So the next, I think about 2 or 3 days later, he came back, and between each set, we used Palmer cooling. We just cooled him through his hands. And from the first day that he came to the lab to that day, he doubled the number of dips that he did. And this was mainly because after his 5 sets, he said, I'm not tired, I can do another set. I'm not tired, I can do another set. I'm not tired, I could do another set. So he did 9 or 10 sets instead of 5, which was his usual. Then he continued to come in every couple days for the next month, and by the end of that month, he was doing 300 dips, 3 times what he initially did. And then we had a friend of his who wanted to do bench press. And that was interesting. He did 225-pound bench presses for 5 sets. And he showed us what he could do, and then we started cooling him. And he steadily increased over the next several weeks. And then we stopped cooling, and he plateaued. No further increase in his numbers. And then we started cooling again, and he continued to go up. So over an 8-week period, no, it wasn't 8 weeks. I think it was 10 weeks. Over a 10-week period, he increased his work volume by 8%. Now you say, well, that didn't sound very high, 8%. Well, we went to the literature and found bench press studies on individuals using anabolic steroids, using performance-enhancing drugs. Over all of those studies with bench press, they all had the same result, and that is an increase of about 1% per week. So if you can get 8% without use of anabolic steroids, why would you go for 1% with an illegal drug? So those are the sorts of experiments we have done a lot of, and it is remarkable how you can greatly enhance the effects of of exercise, of conditioning. I guess the one most unusual one, the one that I'm most proud of, is I had some female freshmen in a course in which we were talking about these physiological phenomena. And some of the women in that course got up to doing over 800 push-ups. And they came in one day and they said, "Dr. Heller, you cost us a lot of money." Why? "We had a formal dance this weekend. We all had to buy new sleeveless dresses." So, so it's a real phenomenon that you can not just recover more rapidly by cooling, but you can increase your work volume. And if you increase your work volume, you get a huge conditioning effect. And the other interesting aspect, if you experience this and you greatly enhance or you greatly increase your work volume on one day, I always can see the words coming out of their mouths. The athletes will say, "I'm going to be so sore tomorrow," and they never are. So we are actually doing a study now which is looking at whether or not cooling during high-level performance prevents delayed onset muscle soreness.
Much of the interesting research you have told us about involves anaerobic work like lifting or sprinting, major aspects of football. But about aerobic sports such as basketball, distance running, cross-country skiing, are there also temperature issues there and opportunities to improve by preventing overheating?
Absolutely. The same mechanisms pertain in aerobic sports, except the dynamics are different. So if you're doing anaerobic, you're predominantly using a particular set of muscles. And I told you that when the muscle burns fuel, it produces a lot of heat. So if you're doing lifting, it's a specific set of muscles that is generating all of that heat, and that's internal to the muscle. Now, you literally have the capacity to cook your own muscles. That sounds a little bit strange. But because of that internal heat production in the muscle, its temperature can go up to very high levels, which damage the tissue, which causes the muscle cells to die and degenerate. Okay? So that heat that you're generating can only get out of the muscle in the blood. And the the muscle metabolism, the muscle heat production can go up maybe 40 or 50 fold. And that's why these individual muscles can essentially become locally hyperthermic, without the whole body becoming hypothermic. So the heat gets out of the muscle in the blood, but the blood flow can't go up 40 or 50 fold through a muscle. And especially when the muscle is contracting, which is squeezing the blood vessels shut. Okay? So with anaerobic activity, the effect of temperature is predominantly local. But with aerobic activity, there's time for that blood flow between strides, between strokes, whatever. There's time where that muscle relaxes and the blood flow takes the heat out of the muscle and distributes it around the body. So sure, with aerobic activity, the overall body temperature rises, but much more slowly than the individual muscle temperature rises with anaerobic activity. So essentially, what you're doing with aerobic activity is you are using the whole volume of your body as a means of storing excess heat, and takes you a long time to reach a core temperature, which then creates the same sort of deficits that you can see by just plain high induction of hyperthermia through environmental conditions. I can give you some examples. An interesting example last spring, our women's soccer team was going for a semifinal match to Arizona. And everybody here was saying, Stanford women don't stand a chance. They're not adapted to the heat. They're not habituated. They're not acclimated. Well, they took our devices with them, our devices we call CoolMitts, and during that game, I've been told that 8 of the Arizona women went down due to heat, and none of the Stanford women, and they won. So, wow. That's an example of benefiting endurance activity.
Dr. Heller, I heard you mention a device to help regulate body temperature called CoolMitt. Can you tell us more about that device?
Sure. We have had many versions of CoolMitt that we have prototyped and have used in various experiments, but the current version I have right here. And what this is a insulated container of an ice slurry, and a perfusant fluid is circulated through that ice, in contact with that ice slurry, and it perfuses a heat exchange pad which is inside this mitt. So all the athlete has to do is just grab the mitt, slip hand into it, and while they're sitting on the bench or resting between sets for 2 or 3 minutes, just dump heat. And it's being used now in a number of different applications, not just athletics. So for example, this past summer, when the salvage teams were clearing away the refuse from the bridge collapse, the Francis Scott Key Bridge collapse in Baltimore, when they were working down inside the bowels of the ship, it was extremely hot and hyperthermia became a problem, and they were using CoolMitts to enable them to cool off and dump heat without having to come all the way out of the ship in order to recover.
Thank you, Dr. Heller, for all of that valuable information on a very hot topic. Pardon the pun. I now know why you titled a recent lecture you gave, "When You're Hot, You're Not." But I also know that you do extensive research on sleep and circadian rhythms. In fact, you recently led a group of scientists and physicians that wrote a white paper on the dangers of sleep loss and jet lag for student athletes. Could you tell us a little bit about the importance of sleep and body rhythms on performance?
Thanks for asking about that, Randy. This is something that has been very much on my mind since last year when there was the realignment of the collegiate athletic conferences. And the first thing that occurred to me when I heard about that is, my goodness, our athletes are going to be traveling across time zones much more frequently. If you think of the Pac-12, which used to be our athletic conference, it's mostly north-south travel. So travel is disturbing, of course, but if it's across time zones, you have jet lag. Now, I'm sure you've experienced jet lag. You fly to East or West Coast, you fly to Europe, and the next day you're hungry at the wrong times of day, you're not sleepy at night, you can't get a normal night's sleep. And these disturbances of your body rhythms and your sleep have huge negative effects on performance, whether it's academic performance or whether it's athletic performance, it doesn't matter. So jet lag is a real concern. And now if all of a sudden we are sending our student athletes across time zones multiple times in a season, that's going to impact their athletic performance, going to impact their academic performance. And the other thing that people don't necessarily appreciate is the fact that if you're going from our West Coast teams to compete in the athletic coastal conference, which Stanford is now a part of, you have to travel to these schools that are in locations that don't necessarily have major airports. So very few of these trips can be done with a direct flight, which is adding to the seriousness of the problem. Now, even if you are without jet lag, even if you're in one location, your sleep has a big effect on your performance. And also, time of day has an effect on your performance. So you're best at doing fine skill rapid response, high cognitive tasks in the morning hours. And you're best at doing these strenuous tasks like lifting in the evening hours. So all of these considerations, I think, play a big role in keeping our athletes healthy and making sure that they are performing at peak capacity.
Before we wrap it up, what's one key piece of advice you'd give to parents who want to help their young athletes stay healthy and perform at their best?
Well, I'd remind them of the advice they probably got from their mothers, and that is eat well and get enough sleep. But in addition, I would say listen to your body. Pay attention to what your body is telling you and respond to it. And of course, stay cool.
Dr. Heller, this has been such an insightful conversation. Thank you for sharing your expertise.
Thank you.
Parents, preventing and recovering from injuries, including hypothermia, is critical in optimizing conditioning, training, and performance. By understanding how the body adapts and recovers, we can help young athletes perform at their best while protecting their future. Taking care of the body is just as important as training it. Injury prevention and recovery should be a priority, not an afterthought. By implementing the right habits now, your athlete can stay strong, healthy, and ready to perform at their best. I hope this session gave you valuable insights into keeping your young athlete in peak condition. Thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next session.